work. He spends most of his time in the forests of southern Illinois and southern Missouri, and today's topic fits right in with his interests. It turns out that the Trail of Tears, the forced migration of Native Americans from the eastern part of our what is now the United States to places like Oklahoma, came through our region. And believe it or not, archaeologists think they can actually find evidence of that that march right here in our area. So what Mark, Ryan, excuse me, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me. Let me see if I can do the screen share thing. I have a couple of monitors that I'm working off of, so this might be a little tricky, but let me see if I can do it. We'll try this. Okay, what screen are we seeing here? Are you seeing my notes screen that's got a couple of slides on it, or are you seeing a blown up presentation? Let's see, I think you're probably seeing, oh, you're seeing both. How's that? Does that look more like a PowerPoint presentation?
Now it does, yes.
Okay, okay. Well, I want to thank you for having me here today. I'm actually the Associate Director at the Center for Archaeological Investigations, and I am an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. So I kind of work on both sides of the line, academic and research here at Southern Illinois University. And I work directly under Mark Wagner, who's the director of the center. So many of you may have seen Dr. Wagner give talks in the area, and we work closely together. So some of what I'll be talking today is research that he has done in the area that I've been involved with, and also some that I've directed myself. So we're going to get into a little bit of both. But this will, today's talk is going to focus on primarily the trail where it runs through Southern Illinois, and another property in southeast Missouri, which is another segment of the trail that runs through the Mark Twain National Forest in what's called their Poplar Bluff Ranger District over there. That's right around Poplar Bluff, just north of that area. So we'll get into a little bit of both. So my involvement with this project began in 2013. There had been research done by SIU prior to that, but there was a historic property along the trail in Southern Illinois known as Bridges Tavern that the Center for Archaeological Investigations had a contract to do some archaeological testing at, to see if we could find anything at that site that might link that tavern to the Trail of Tears, to that era, that would confirm some of the oral histories that we knew about that site. So I worked out there, and then after that, we had a series of what we would consider cultural resource management projects. These are historic preservation focused projects that that both state and federal agencies were interested in, to document properties along the trail and the trail itself. So this falls under the umbrella of what we would call cultural resource management in archaeology. And that is really geared towards compliance efforts by these agencies like the National Forests, or state agencies where they have state lands that may be impacted. They're trying to stay in compliance with laws like the Historic Preservation Act. So they make funds available that then, when we enter into partnerships, the Center for Archaeological Investigations as a research center at the university, we've made partners with many of these different agencies that allow us to do this type of research. They provide the funding through these partnerships. We do the work for them, and it allows us to provide some learning opportunities for our students, who then can go out and do the research with us, and we can take them out in the field and give them more of a hands-on training opportunity, more so than they would get in the classroom when it comes to doing archaeology and learning about these things. So before I go into that research, I want to give a little background on the history of the Trail of Tears, what it means, where the idea behind Indian removal comes from, and what groups we're talking about. This section comes a lot from other research that historians have done. So I'll try to do it justice. I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a historian. I know how to do historic research, but most of this information was already provided for me. This is not new information that I'm coming up with. The policy of Indian removal in the eastern United States and the Southeast in particular, it dates back before the American Revolution. We could probably go all the way back to the first European contact with Native Americans in this region prior to that, which would be hundreds of years before before the Trail of Tears. So the indigenous people of the Southeast would have experienced a lot of cultural change, loss of life. There were epidemics that occurred as a result of disease that was rampant from those interactions. They adopted cultural traditions during that period of time from their European contacts, and they resisted European encroachment. So that's a long process. You can think of that as occurring, like I said, over hundreds of years prior to the period that we're talking about. So that period of time from when Europeans first enter the southeastern United States to when the Trail of Tears actually occurs is a longer period of time than the United States has been around today. So our country is younger than what those people would have experienced. So it's important to keep some of those that time scale in mind when we're talking about these people, because they would not have been static. The Indians that were first met by Europeans when they entered the Southeast were very different people than those that we see in the 19th century who are subject to Indian removal. The official policies regarding Indian removal that our government were involved with could probably be traced back to just before the American Revolution. It's often pointed out that the Transylvania Purchase, or what is sometimes referred to as the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in 1775, kind of sets the stage for the Cherokee anyway, losing large chunks of their land. And it provides access into more of the interior southeastern United States for travelers. There's a road that's set up during that time. And that treaty I have in quotes because it's really more of a private land sale that occurred, ceded over 20 million acres of land that was traditional hunting grounds for the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Shawnee in the area that's today Kentucky and Tennessee, between the Kentucky River and the Cumberland River. So this is a large area of land that settlers began to push into following that 1775 land purchase. And then there were a series of treaties between this and when the Cherokee are actually removed that continue to refine what the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation and the other tribes' land holdings were at that time. And those treaties were very often in name only. The white settlers that were moving into that region did not very often respect those treaty boundaries, despite there being legal consequences for them not doing so. So there was a lot of pressure building at this time. Another big historic event that we should be reminded of prior to Indian removal is the Louisiana Purchase that happened in 1803. This really increased the size of the United States land holdings. So the early American land holdings are growing at this time. And now there's this big tract of land west of the Mississippi River that, while inhabited by other indigenous Native American populations and tribes, was viewed by the white settlers in the East as an area where we might be able to relocate the tribes that were currently living in the Southeast. We can't talk about Indian removal without bringing up Andrew Jackson, who is probably one of the most emblematic figures at this time regarding Indian removal. During the early 19th century, Andrew Jackson was a legislator and involved in military campaigns, a military leader who fought several of the tribal groups in the Southeast and won battles against them. He negotiated several treaties, and leading up to his election, he ran on a platform that included removing Indians from the eastern United States. So it's often noted that his presidency is perhaps the most anti-Indian presidency that we had experienced in our history. He's elected to the presidency in 1828, and beyond that being a crucial year for some of the changes that were about to occur for the Cherokee and the other tribes in the Southeast, that's also the same year that gold was discovered in what was the Cherokee Nation at that time. So in addition to the pressures that they were experiencing from just settlers encroaching on their land, now there's this extra economic incentive that the United States government is aware of that would be a reason to push them out of their homelands. So in 1830, the Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, which really it kind of sets the stage for what's about to happen, where this gives the president the power to negotiate treaties and ultimately the removal of the indigenous populations that are left in the Southeast. So the focus of this talk will be on the Cherokee, but we should really mention the groups that are most prevalent in this conversation at the time, and they're often referred to as the Five. And this includes the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Cherokee. So that group of tribes in the Southeast, they are all part of this effort, this pressure that's being applied by both the states in that area, so Georgia is a major player at the time, the Carolinas, Tennessee, to remove these individuals, to remove the tribes from those lands. So each of these groups, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, they all also have their own histories regarding removal and resistance to that removal. And they have their own routes that they took at different times. So it's important to remember that when we talk about the Trail of Tears today, we're discussing the Cherokee, but these other groups were also affected during the 1830s, but the early part of the 19th century in general. Another thing that I'd like to draw your attention to at that is that, as I said earlier, the Cherokee at that time are very different than the Indians that were first met by Europeans when they entered the southeastern part of the United States. There had been hundreds of years of interactions between Europeans and the early American settlers and these native populations. And as such, those groups had changed very much over time. And many of the Cherokee in the 1830s were living on farmsteads. They were engaging in the market economy of the era. They were relying on domesticated livestock and domesticated crops, and very much living like their white counterparts. Many of them were also taking part, were also transitioning into more of a plantation lifestyle, like you see their white contemporaries doing in areas in the South. And some of them become very, very wealthy. What I'm showing you here are a couple of homes that are still in existence today that are Cherokee, the plantation homes of Cherokee chiefs during the early 19th century. So Ridge House and Chief Van's house. These are large plantation homes that represent houses that wealthy Cherokee would have lived in at the time. So these individuals are not only adopting a lot of the traditions of their white contemporaries, they're also very economically successful. They have large land holdings. Some of them, in fact, did have slaves during this period. So they're holding African slaves, just like their white counterparts were. And they're sending their children to be educated in universities in the East. So these are not the Indians that people typically think of that get shown in popular culture, where they're dressing in loincloths and nomadic people with feathers in their hair. These are people who are as modern in the Western white sense as their contemporaries were. So that's something to keep in mind as we think going forward about this removal process, who was actually being removed, and the narratives that were being kind of told at the time regarding who these people were and why they needed to be removed. So that brings us to again, that narrative that is going on at the time. We have the settlers in that area, the states, and a contingency of people in the US government led by Andrew Jackson, who are continuing to talk about the native groups in the East as being they're not as civilized as their white counterparts. They're not using their land to the full extent, and that land would be better in the hands of their white contemporaries. We can see this thought process in an annual message that Andrew Jackson gave to Congress in 1835, where he states that the plan of removing the Aboriginal people who yet remain within the settled portions of the United States to the country west of the Mississippi approaches its consummation. It was adopted on the most mature consideration of the condition of this race. All preceding experiments for the improvement of Indians have failed. It seems now to be an established fact that they cannot live in contact with a civilized community and prosper. So here we have entered into the congressional record a statement by the president telling us that that these people just are not civilized enough. We've tried to bring them up to our standards and they just are not. And that really stands in stark contrast to what we see when we look at the historic record and we see some of the images and the information about the wealth and the land holdings and the cultural traditions that these people had during that era. Now, for the Cherokee, the moment of truth really comes with the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. This is a treaty that was signed between a relatively small delegation of Cherokee and the United States government that ceded all of their remaining land in the eastern United States in exchange for land in Indian Territory, which is today Oklahoma. They were also promised a cash payment in exchange for that. And that sets the stage for what will come in the next few years and what we know today as Indian removal and ultimately the Trail of Tears, which is both kind of metaphorical and an actual trail system. Now, I mentioned that that's a relatively small delegation that signs that treaty, and there are factions within the Cherokee at that time where you have individuals who want to move forward with this process of Indian removal. That they see this as an inevitable thing and that they should negotiate with the United States. And secure their own land somewhere beyond the Mississippi, and also get some cash payment in exchange for that. And then you have a much larger delegate. You have a much larger contingency who are opposed to this. So the major players at that time, there's several of them, but I've got a few on the screen here. Major Ridge was a chief of the Cherokee. He and his son, John Ridge, who had been educated at universities in the East and was a newspaper man, they were on the side of signing the treaty. They were part of that delegation that signed the Treaty of New Echota. And New Echota is the capital of the Cherokee Nation at that time in Georgia. So that's where the name of that treaty comes from. And then we have Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross. And you'll notice in these pictures, this is what the wealthier Cherokee dressed like at the time. So they looked very much like their wealthy Southern plantation owning counterparts. And John Ross was very much opposed to ceding this land, to giving away Cherokee land. And he led an opposition movement over the coming years to this treaty, gathering up to 15,000 signatures against it. Despite that, the Congress approved the treaty, they ratified it, and put it into law. It was supposed to be voluntary. The native people in the Cherokee tribe were supposed to voluntarily give up their land in exchange for new land in Indian territory. But that didn't happen. For a large part, the majority of the Cherokee resisted and remained in their homes. There were some factions that left voluntarily, the Rosses included, but the majority of the groups at that time remained. And beginning in June of 1838, a policy was implemented for the forced removal of these indigenous groups. So the people that remained in their homes, in some cases, military leaders came to their houses and removed them forcefully. They were then taken to a series of what can only be described as concentration camps in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, and divided up into 17 detachments. These detachments, which you'll hear that term used a lot for these groups as they travel along the Trail of Tears, they were led by military leaders, and these are their traveling parties. There are roughly 1,000 individuals in each one. The individuals in the detachments are given a small amount of money to help with costs along the way, but it wasn't nearly enough. So the journey was pretty arduous. There were 4 primary routes that are discussed that that these different detachments take during this period. Those would be the northern route. Then there's the Binge route, which was taken by the Binge detachment, and the Bell route by the Bell detachment. And then there's several detachments that took water routes. So they took existing waterways, navigable waterways. Roughly 17,000 Cherokee were removed during this time. That's just a rough estimate. And probably more than 4,000, roughly 4,000 individuals died during the removal process from 1838 to 1839. And some of these deaths occur in the camps when they're being assembled, and some occur along the trail itself. And many occurred in Southern Illinois because there's conditions that were happening here during that winter that made that trip very difficult. So what you see on the screen in front of you now is a representation of where these different routes ran. So the Trail of Tears, when we speak of it, like I said before, it's both metaphorical in the sense that the Trail of Tears conjures up this idea about Indian removal and reminds us of this period of time and what was happening. But the Trail of Tears is also a physical as a series of physical trails on the surface of the landscape that we can go out and see. They traveled along existing roads. They weren't blazing new trails. They were going through existing roadways and along existing waterways, and through historic documentation and archaeological survey, we've been able to identify many of the locations where they would have traveled. So this physical trail is still in existence. So to begin with, I'd like to discuss the northern route, which some of the groups did travel this before 1838. In 1837, on more of that voluntary removal process, but the forced removal begins in October of 1838 and goes through March of 1839. And 11 of the 17 detachments travel along this northern route, which leaves from the area that they were gathered in kind of that multi-state area around Georgia there. And they come up through Tennessee, across Kentucky, and into southern Illinois, across the southern part of the state. They then cross the Mississippi River and diverge across on a couple of different paths across Missouri, down into Arkansas, and then ultimately into Indian Territory, or what is today Oklahoma. In southern Illinois, this route follows roughly what is today State Highway 146 through the southern part of the state. At that time, it would have been called the Golconda to Cape Girardeau Road. And it's, like I said, roughly along the same route as Highway 146. It diverges from there, depending on where we are on that route. But they would have entered at Golconda. And at that time, there was only maybe 20 or a little more homes in the town of Golconda. So you can imagine there's 11 detachments coming through. It's roughly 11,500 individuals that pass through that area over the course of several months during kind of the fall, winter, and spring months between October of 1838 and March of 1839. So that would have been quite the sight for the people who were living in that area. And there would be a big economic impact for them as well, as people are buying supplies and coming through. They would have traveled along that route up towards what is today Vienna and West Vienna, and then on to the Anna Jonesboro area, where they then diverged to two separate river crossing areas where there were ferries along the Mississippi, where they could then enter into Missouri and continue on that leg of the journey. So I want to discuss some of the historic properties in southern Illinois. There's too many of them for me to cover all in one talk. So what I'm going to discuss just briefly will be a few that the Center for Archaeological Investigations has had some part in. These are properties that, in many cases, they're near springs where the Cherokee would have preferentially camped along the trail as they were going through. There's also oral histories associated with many of these properties that suggest that, that the Cherokee did in fact camp there as they were moving through. So these are sites that we've been approached to document or provide some supporting evidence for that they may have been directly associated with the trail, at least during my time at the center. This is, I'm going to focus on those. Okay, so the first of those would be Bridges Tavern, which is, it's west of West Vienna and between that and Pleasant Grove, just off of Highway 146. And this property is privately owned. And going back to 1818, the Bridges family, we've documented that they did have a tavern that was in operation at that site. And that tavern was in existence until the late 1800s and eventually demolished. It's no longer there today. You can't see the tavern itself. But Bridges Tavern is often associated with this a second building that's called the Wayside Store. Oral histories suggest that in addition to the tavern, there was a small store where people could buy goods, and the Cherokee had stopped there and purchased goods and camped in the area as they were moving across the landscape. We were invited out to this property in 2013 to do archaeological testing to see if we could help confirm that. The Wayside Tavern, there is a hand-hewn log structure that still exists on that property, and it's inside today of this barn that was built during the 1940s. So they built the barn around this log structure, which in part protects it from the elements and has preserved it for all these years. So our research did identify artifacts and evidence. Mark Wagner did a lot of this research, historic documentation that supports that this tavern and Wayside Store were in operation when the Cherokee came through. This building may have been a store that they purchased goods from, but the property as a whole was definitely there and something that is likely associated directly with the Cherokee as they came through. Another site that's commonly discussed in Southern Illinois related to the Trail of Tears is Campground Church. And this is another one that the center has been involved in documenting. Again, Mark Wagner and other researchers from Southern Illinois University, including Harvey Henson, who does remote sensing and geophysical survey. They've worked at this particular site, which is located just west of Highway 57 and north of Highway 146, between Pleasant Grove and Anna. And the Campground Church property, it sits on a knoll, a relatively flat area that today has a cemetery on the property. This was at the time when the Cherokee came through, a property that was owned by George Heilman and his family. The Heilman property had a mill on it and a spring. And oral histories indicate that the Cherokee did camp there. Up to 1,000 of them camped at that site. And there, over the years, within that cemetery, there's an area that is unmarked that everyone has pointed to as this is the location of the graves of the Cherokee. So the idea was that there are graves present at that cemetery that are unmarked that were Cherokee who were buried there during their removal process. And the geophysical survey that was done by Harvey Henson seems to confirm that there are graves present at that site in that area. So that again is a property that we're pretty confident is directly associated with the trail, and there may in fact be burials within that cemetery that relate to the Cherokee, that are Cherokee. And then more recently, we've had some involvement with a property that's referred to as Morgan's Mill, which is on the west side of Jonesboro as you leave town on 146. This property was in private hands until very recently. In 2019, the Department of Transportation acquired this property. There used to be a house on the site, but it has been removed. And it sits right along Dutch Creek. Now, when the Morgan family had their farmstead here, they operated a mill at this site right along the creek. And we know that that during the winter months of 1838, the Cherokee were stopped in this area and had to camp along the creek in these fields that surround that property today. Many of the detachments got backed up there because the Mississippi River froze that winter. And they were stuck on the Illinois side for months, and it was a very difficult time for them. So they camped near this Morgan's Mill property. There's a spring in the area, and the creek provided them with and the Morgan family and the mill provided them with some of the goods they needed. Since the Department of Transportation has acquired this property, we have done some work with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey when they've gone out to to investigate this property a little further to see if there's any evidence of the mill that remains. And they believe that they have found some of the remnants of the mill right there in Dutchess Creek. So there are structures and archaeological deposits that date to that period. So this property is also one that we know of that's directly associated with the trail and is still in some form present on the landscape today. So Morgan's Mill is right here along Dutch Creek. And then as they left that area, the trail diverges. So you can see that there's two trails that come off in that area, and one goes to Willard's Landing and the other goes to Hamburg Landing. Hamburg Landing will become important in just a minute when I'm talking about the trail segments that we've documented over there. But these would be river crossing points that after the Mississippi thawed, they were able to travel down to these different ferry crossings and take a ferry into Missouri. So following some of the documentation of the historic properties that we've done, we began to be approached by the national forests in the area to ask if we had the capability to help them document trail segments that go across federally owned properties, because they're very interested in preserving those trail segments and maintaining good record of their location and what they look like today versus what they may look like in the future, to see if there's any kind of erosion that's occurring or other types of damage. So this involves a multi-step process. We have to go to historic maps. There's a series of them that we're lucky enough to have from this period of time. Many of them were developed by the Government Land Office. So we have these GLO maps that go back to the early part of the 19th century that show roads and homes and properties along those roads that date to. Some of these maps are very proximate to when the trail happened. Some of them are right around 1837. So those are very, we feel very confident that those maps would provide us with good information about where the trail exists, or where it existed at that time. Now, getting those old maps to line up with the maps that we have today is sometimes difficult. So we have to do a little bit of creative work in our modern software systems to get that to work out. But we use these old maps and the journals that are associated with them, and historic documents like newspaper articles that discuss where people may have been camping and staying along the trail. All that evidence together helps to point us in a direction to say, okay, this segment may be one that was part of a road that we know the Cherokee would have been traveling along at that time. More recently, we've had some technology available to us that comes in very handy for identifying things in areas of the forest in particular, where we can't see the surface as well. There's a technology called LIDAR that we have available to us, and LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging. And it's a technique that creates a 3D model of the Earth's surface. And the way that it works is planes fly over the Earth's surface, fitted with GPS, so global positioning systems to know exactly where they are in the world. And they shine laser light down on the surface that then reflects back up to cameras. And those cameras use that information to create a three-dimensional model of the ground surface. And this is available for large chunks of the United States, and we're lucky enough in the southern part of the state to have most of the southern part of Illinois covered by LIDAR data. Now, this is what a LIDAR image looks like in cross-section. This probably is a little confusing to look at, but what you're seeing here on the screen is a three-dimensional model made up of points that are, each pixel represents a bit of light that's coming back to the camera. So the kind of diffuse pixels that you see above that more dense area at the bottom, those are pixels that their light is reflecting off of the tree canopy as it's flying over the forest. So some of that light reflects right off of the leaves and comes back to the plane. And some of it penetrates below that and goes down to the Earth's surface. And that what is called the ground surface return, or the second or third return from those light sources, we can filter that tree canopy out, and we can actually look directly at the surface. We can also look at these cross sections, and we can see things like this particular area here that I'm highlighting, which is a bit of a valley between what seems to be two hills. This is an eroded area of trail, and I'll show you in a this is a plan view map of that same area. This segment was taken from where I put that box on the screen. So now we're looking down on the Earth's surface, and we've removed the tree canopy. And you can see this three-dimensional relief model that has been made of that particular area. Now, what you're looking at here, this is that segment of Hamburg Hill that leads down to Hamburg Landing. This is on Shawnee National Forest property. And you can see in this image what appears to be a deep eroded area on that hillside. When we look at this, we can start to draw some conclusions before we even get out into the field. We can compare this to existing roads to know if this is an area where there is a known road today. And then we can follow these out and say, okay, well, some of this is an existing road, but some of it appears not to be. And it has all the morphological characteristics of an old road bed. So we can map that out and take that information into the field with us to help locate these things on the ground. Now, that involves traditional archaeological survey. It's not quite as exciting for some people as the high-tech stuff that we do, but this is really where I think archaeologists shine, because we get out there in the field, we wander around in the woods, and we find these things on the ground. You can see in this image, I've got a picture of Dr. Wagner here in the foreground as he's leading us on a journey. I'm sure he's taking notes on something there in that photograph. And then we've got another one of our researchers who's out there wandering around. And what we're doing in these photos is we're searching for segments of the trail. We're in the general location where we knew that it existed. We're following out segments that we have already identified, and we're trying to see if we can put the whole thing together into one long segment. While we're out there, we take some technology with us that helps with this. We use relatively high-tech GPS systems that give us very accurate readings on where the center of the trail is. So we'll run this equipment down the center of the trail. This is surveying equipment that's used in many different fields, but we've adopted it in archaeology to help us with this process. And this is where Hamburg Hill is. So if you remember from that earlier map, I showed there was a road that diverges to the south, west of Jonesboro, and that segment of the trail goes across Shawnee National Forest property down Hamburg Hill. And we see in that area these deep erosional cuts. When you arrive in that area of the forest, you're driving along a forest road that if you look on either side of you, you'll see these deep erosional cuts. You're below what was originally the ground surface. So this gives you some indication that you're driving across a very old road bed, that this has been here a long time and that it has eroded out quite a bit. So this is actually a segment of what would have been that Golconda to Cape Girardeau road at the time. And the existing roadway does travel along it at this point, and we can still see this erosional path that gives us evidence that this is a very old segment of that road. Again, here's another shot from that same Hamburg Hill area. You can see these deep erosional cuts on either side of the road. So you see this quite often when you're driving around in Southern Illinois. There's a lot of old roads through the area. And these deep erosional cuts are a clue that you're on one that's been there for a long time, probably several hundred years. At Hamburg Hill, though, as this road kind of makes a turn, what was the original roadway goes off into the forest. You lose it. You're not driving along it anymore, but you can follow that out into the woods. Most people don't recognize what it is they're looking at when they're walking through an area like this. They may not recognize that this was an old road cut. It's very overgrown, but as we follow this out and we follow our old maps, we can see that this relatively eroded swale was part of that road cut. Now this travels down that hillside and it gets a little deeper as we get farther down the hill. And again, you can see that this is a very deeply eroded cut. This is following along nicely with right where the road existed on historic maps. And then when you get down into the bottom, when you're off the hill, things get a little more difficult to see. We keep following them out all the way to the end of federal property when we're doing work for the Forest Service. And we identify even these small swales. You can't see them very well in these photographs, but there is a bit of an eroded path through the forest here. And when you're out in the woods, you can spot them. And like I said, as you continue along, you can convince yourself that you are in fact seeing these things. Here's another area where it's very hard to see the trail, but it does exist. We have evidence on the side here of this photograph. You can see a bit of this erosion that's going on where the path has eroded away a bit of the existing land surface. And there's a bit of a swale on the surface. And that gives us evidence all the way up to the edge of the property that segment of that Hamburg Hill trail is still there. So we've been able to document what the trail looks like out there, how deep it is, what the erosion looks like, photograph it, and provide very accurate GPS information for the Forest Service going forward. Now in Southeast Missouri, Southeast Missouri, in the Boot Heel, we have another route. This is not the northern route. This is the route taken by the Binge Detachment from October of 1838 to January 1839. This is a separate detachment, and why they avoided the northern route, we're not 100% sure. It's possible that this group had more slaves with them, since slavery was prevalent among some of the wealthier plantation owners in the Cherokee, and they may have been trying to avoid crossing into states that were less friendly for slave owners at that time. So the Binge Detachment, they leave from Alabama and they go in across Tennessee through a little bit of Kentucky and then directly into Missouri up towards that Cape Girardeau area, down through the Poplar Bluff district and down to the Current River and cross into Arkansas and then over to Indian Territory. Now, for this segment, we're lucky enough to have research that was already done by the Department of Transportation's archaeologists in Missouri. Russell Wiseman has been very gracious and given us some of the information that he's gathered on the trail over there. Rusty went to the 1837 GLO records and put this map together for us that we were able to use, and it tracks the trail all the way from Cape Girardeau all the way through their Poplar Bluff district down, well, it goes into Greenville and then down to the Current River. And that trace goes past a number of waterways and historic farmsteads that we know where they existed. So this allows us to plot out this location a little bit better. This was a state road at the time. That's why that was plotted in. We've overlaid images like that onto modern maps and then created a new layer that we can then take out into the field with us. And we worked primarily in the Poplar Bluff Ranger District. This is for the National Forest. Remember, they're the ones funding this research. And what we did for this project is everywhere that it crossed Forest Service property, we went to those locations and we tried to identify the trail on the ground. These properties in total encompass about 12 miles of trail segments. And we went out and did what was very similar to what we've done here in Southern Illinois. We walked them. We went out into the forest, and it's best to go this time of year or maybe even a little later because the vegetation's low. You can see things better. We took some students with us, and they helped document the trail. So here you can see one of our previous students, Andrew Van Cleve, as he's stringing a line level across the trail so that we could draw profile maps. So we draw a sketch at different locations along the trail, different segments while we were out there, and draw, physically sketch in what the profile of the trail looked like at that time, to give the Forest Service a little more information about what it looks like today and what they might expect in the future. Again, this time of year is good to go out. It even helps if there's a little light snow on the ground because you can see the relief a little bit more, but you can see here's a segment of the trail as it goes off into the distance. We can see this very light swale on the surface. This is kind of on the top of a ridge. Oftentimes they parallel existing forest roads or cross existing forest roads. So we get good information on where that occurs, because where they cross, those roads can start to create problems for the trail itself, for its preservation because of erosion. Here, one of our researchers, Ayla Amadio, is standing in the trail helping us document it there. And again, we're drawing maps when we're out in the field. So we're hand sketching these things at different locations. We're drawing them in profile. We're comparing this to those historic maps that I was talking about. Here's the locations of those profiles that I'm showing on the right-hand side of the screen. And in some cases, we're going into areas where it's very difficult to see the trail. These are wildlife openings that we're in here, and there's lots of overgrown vegetation, but we know where the trail enters that and exits it, and we fight our way through that. You can see there again is Ayla helping us do some mapping on the trail. You can't even see the trail in this photo, but believe me, it was there. And again, we follow these all the way to the edge of Forest Service property when we're doing these contracts. And oftentimes we can see that trail continuing off into the distance across a private parcel. We don't go onto those parcels, but we know that they exist, and we note that when we're doing our reports. So my guess would be in all of these areas where we have kind of these discontinuous areas of national forest, if there's a forest property adjacent to it, that's in private hands, these trail segments probably are almost continuous through these areas. So these are physical reminders on the landscape that of where the Cherokee came through during this removal process. So as I wrap up, I want to talk about why we even care to document the trail location. And one of the things that I'll leave you with here is a story about what happened in Tennessee several years ago. The Forest Service at that time, they knew that the trail was there, but there was some miscommunication between them and a private contractor who was coming out to do work for the Forest Service in Tennessee on national forest land. They were worried about erosion. And you have these different entities within the Forest Service itself who have different directives. So the groups that were worried about people driving along these trails or the hillside eroding away, they weren't communicating well with the archaeologists within the Forest Service, so they didn't have clear information about where the trail was located, or that this was actually a segment of the Trail of Tears. Well, a contractor came in and created a series of bulldozer piles along the trail. You can see this gentleman walking across one of those. And this was in 2014 when this activity was undertaken. And it wasn't until 2016 when this was discovered that they had damaged the Trail of Tears. And this led to a series of newspaper articles, and the Cherokee tribe in particular, becoming involved in this. And it's very bad publicity, very bad relations between the Cherokee and the Forest Service as a result of this. And this is the exact type of thing that these agencies want to prevent in the future. So that's why a lot of the funding is provided to do the types of research that we're doing. They want to make sure that they do not destroy these features. They want to make sure that they preserve them as much as they can. And they'd like to provide some interpretation along that trail to help people learn about the past and why this is an important resource and what it reminds us of and what it says about who we are and where we came from and why, where our country is today with how we've developed as a result of things like Indian removal and particularly the Cherokees removal along the Trail of Tears. Another reason why we document this trail is because it's very present in the mind of the Cherokee today. These people are not relegated to just the past. These are modern individuals who live in Oklahoma today, many of them. Well, I mean, the tribes themselves do, the tribal governments are located there. There are many members of the Cherokee who live all throughout the country, but people are very interested in the trail today. And the Cherokee do come back and they walk the Trail of Tears through Southern Illinois and other areas. There are these young people that do these trail rides along the trail because they want to draw attention to the trail and remember the journey that their ancestors took and the hardships that they endured along that trail. So it's very important to people, and documenting it and making sure that we know as much about it as possible and preserving it. So we never forget that past is an important part of all of this. So I think that I'll go ahead and leave the talk there, and I can open it up for questions now if anyone's interested in discussing this a little bit further.
Ryan, I want to let the members know that you can use the chat function to write out a question, or you can ask directly, but it might be easier if a bunch of you want to ask questions, write them in the chat area and we will take care of it. Thank you. Questions for Ryan?
I see Mark Wagner has joined us today too. So
welcome, Mark.
He also has questions. I'm sure he has questions for me. Are there GPS maps published on the route? From Robert Brissa. There are maps that have been done in Southern Illinois specifically that are available to the public that identify a number of the historic sites along the trail. We have a recent PhD graduate from the anthropology department here named Kaylee Sharp, who helped produce those maps and provide them, I think, to the National Park Service, who ultimately got those, but they're GIS layers that are available online. And for professionals who do archaeology, we finally got there's a layer available to them in GIS that is with the state agency that controls those files now. And that was only made available within the last few years. Up into even just a few years ago, there were researchers that would come down to the southern part of the state to document archaeological sites, and they had no idea where the Trail of Tears was or that it even came through the southern part of the state because they didn't know where to do the research for that. So we've luckily got that added in the last several years. Who named the Trail of Tears? I'm not sure if I can give you the name of a person who has named the Trail of Tears. It's been in popular culture for a long time. That name, let's see. Did wealthy Cherokee walk, or were they able to travel via modern transportation methods? They would have had carriages that they were pulled along on the way. Many people did walk though. But yes, those wealthier people would have brought along horses and carriages. And like I said, they had their slaves with them if they owned slaves. So that's, I'm sure their experience was much different than the poorer individuals in the Cherokee at that time. Do you happen to know why they didn't take a more direct route west rather than going north and then west? These are well-known trails for the Cherokee. So these came up through like their hunting lands and their routes that they would have known. There are conditions through I think Arkansas. There's swampland down in some of those areas where it's difficult to walk through those areas. It's only been since the 19th century that they've been able to drain off some of those locations to make it more easy to pass through them. So getting to the west was a little more circuitous back then. And there were only a few areas where there were ferry crossings that made it easy for groups to pass through. So yeah, they did kind of have to travel up north and then around to get around some of that stuff. A lot of natural obstacles in the way. Did the chiefs leave those nice homes? Yeah, voluntarily some of them did. So like I said, the ones that negotiated the treaty, they did leave voluntarily. Those individuals were, like I mentioned later, assassinated as a result of their actions. But yeah, they left those homes behind, and many of them exist today as historic museums, so people can go visit them as historic sites in Georgia. Can a person walk the entire trail like the Appalachian Trail, or is this something that might happen with the trail in the future? It crosses a lot of private property, and it's not easily navigable today, the actual trail. There are portions of it that follow existing roadways. So in Southern Illinois, for example, when the Cherokee come to visit, they'll go along State Route 146, and you can travel that highway, and you'll see markers along the highway that says you're now on the Trail of Tears or you're departing the Trail of Tears. So in those areas, that's kind of how people travel the trail. On national forest land, the trail is often marked. So that area at Hamburg Hill, they can visit that location, but it's discontinuous. So you can't hike the entire thing. And I don't know if that would ever be possible. It's just so, there are many areas where it's very overgrown, and it might work against the preservation effort to essentially clear cut those areas to provide access to a trail. It would probably lead to more erosion. So keeping some of that hidden away does preserve those segments to a certain degree. I mean, we know where they are. We're not necessarily opposed to people going out to those areas, but turning it into a walking trail could damage the trail. Let's see. Did some of the Cherokee use the rivers to get into Indian territory? Yes, they did. There were a few, I think 4 detachments that took water routes. It's my understanding that the Cherokee, that the traveling on water was more dangerous, both in the actual sense that you could drown, but also spiritually dangerous. There are issues with water related to their religious beliefs that made that journey undesirable. So I think fewer of them wanted to do that. Just a comment, my husband, Jim Cather, was 1/6 Cherokee's man. Okay. When you've been on national forest land that abuts private land, do the property owners ever ask if you examine the trail on their property? So I occasionally do run into private landowners whose properties abut these national forest lands. And I am very approachable when I'm out there working. I think sometimes when landowners in these rural communities see someone working on national forest land, there's this kind of historic animosity between landowners and the federal government. So I always try to tell them what we're doing and why we're out there, and that we're not trying to like trespass or take land from anybody, because there's these narratives that that's what's happening when we're doing archaeology out there. But We do occasionally run into landowners that will say, well, I have a segment that runs across my property, or I heard that they camped out on my property. And if they're open to it, we do go out onto their land and take a look. But usually that's just to confirm that there is something out there. And the funding is usually not there for us to do large scale work on those properties. Are there trails north of us in Illinois that other tribes took? Well, there are trails north of us. The natives from the southeast would have gone primarily this northern route and south. But yes, some of those groups around the Great Lakes, for example, would have gone on other routes. I'm not as familiar with where those routes exist, but yes, they would be there. What archaeological info other than routes do you find along the trail? Well, a lot of times that's we find supporting evidence of a farmstead or springs. Sometimes we'll identify the location of a spring that may be associated with kind of an oral history that says, okay, we knew the Cherokee camped in this area. Archaeologically, can we go out and find any evidence of that? We may find a spring in the area. We may find campsites. Now, campsites are very difficult during this period because, like I said, we're talking about Native people that lived very much like their white counterparts. So when you find a campsite from the 19th century that is for a Cherokee, you're not finding chipstone tools and crude pottery like you would from a Native American site that's thousands of years old. They'd have, broken ceramics and things that you would find at any farmstead that their European or American counterparts would have lived at. So it's supporting evidence that we have to then pair with historic documentation and see what connections we can draw there. So for example, in Missouri, when we were doing that work, there's a number of farmsteads that we found right along the trail. Those farmsteads are probably directly associated with the trail. They would have existed at that time in 1838 when they came through. But we may not have a journal. Like many of the people living in these rural communities were not even literate. So we don't have written records from them. We just have the mundane remains of their home sites. We know that there were people out there, and we know that they were probably there when the trail came through, but their exact relationship to the tribe, did they talk to them? Did they camp on their property? We may never know that. So all we have is this kind of supporting, like, this is a farmstead that was there when they came through, and we know that the trail went right past it. So it's probably directly associated with it in some way. Let's see. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat. Is there any other questions that people may have or critiques?
Well, you did a great job, Ryan. A very interesting talk, and thank you so much for visiting with us and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks. I enjoyed it. This has been a couple of years in the making, this talk. I was first approached by Donna Butler. Gosh, I think maybe 2.5 years ago now. It was before the pandemic. And so a talk 2 years in the making, but I really only made this PowerPoint in the last week, like a good academic always does. So I kind of adapted it from several other talks that I've had. So I hope you enjoyed it. Mark told me there'd be coffee and donuts at this thing, but I guess not today. So so after we're done here, I'm gonna have to go get another cup of coffee, I think.
Our donuts and coffee are out at Panera's.
Okay.
It's just east of us.
Yeah, is there a voucher?
Highway 13.
I can give them?
we're applauding you, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you
Simon.
very much. I appreciate it. I enjoyed talking to everyone today. And we're always available here at the Center for Archaeological Investigations to answer questions for people. So you can find my email address on SIU's website if anyone would like to contact me with any further questions about the trail or anything related to archaeology in this area in particular. We're always happy to help discuss those things or take in information, because a lot of people who have lived in this area a long time know more about some of what we would be interested in than we may know ourselves. So so feel free.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, have a good day.
Okay.
We'll shut down now, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.